6. How S implies that we cannot avoid acting irrationally. Remember Kate, who accepts the hedonistic theory about self-interest. We may accept some other theory, but on these other theories, there could be cases that, in the relevant respects, are like Kate's. And the claims that follow could be restated to cover these cases. It is best for Kate that her strongest desire is that her books be as good as possible. But because this is true, she often works very hard, making herself for a period exhausted and depressed. Because Kate is a hedonist, she believes that when she acts in this way, she is doing what is worse for her. Because she also accepts S, Kate believes that in these cases she is acting irrationally. Moreover, these irrational acts are quite voluntary. She acts as she does because, though she cares about her own interests, this is not her strongest desire. She has an even stronger desire that her books be as good as possible. It would be worse for her if this desire became weaker. She is acting on a set of motives that, according to S, it would be irrational for her to cause herself to lose. It might be claimed that, because Kate is acting on such motives, she cannot be acting irrationally. But this claim assumes G1, the claim that was shown to be false by the case I called Schelling's answer to armed robbery. If we share Kate's belief that she is acting irrationally in a quite voluntary way, we might claim that she is irrational. But Kate can deny this. Since she believes S, she can claim, when I do what I believe will be worse for me, my act is irrational. But because I am acting on a set of motives that it would be irrational for me to cause myself to lose, I am not irrational. More precisely, I am rationally irrational. She can add, in acting on my desire to make my books better, I am doing what will be worse for me. This is a bad effect in self-interested terms, but it is part of a set of effects that is one of the best possible sets. Though I sometimes suffer because this is my strongest desire, I also benefit, and the benefits are greater than the losses. That I sometimes act irrationally, doing what I know will be worse for me, is the price I have to pay if I am to get these greater benefits. And this is a price worth paying. It may be objected, you do not have to pay this price. You could work less hard. You could do what you believe would be better for you. You are not compelled to do what you believe to be irrational. She could answer, this is true. I could work less hard, but I only would do this if my desire to make my books better was much weaker. And this would be, on the whole, worse for me. It would make my work boring. How can I bring it about that I shall not in the future freely choose in such cases to do what I believe to be irrational? I could bring this about only by changing my desires in a way that would be worse for me. This is the sense in which I cannot have the greater benefits without paying the lesser price. I cannot have the desires that are best for me without sometimes freely choosing to act in ways that will be worse for me. This is why, when I act irrationally in these cases, I need not regard myself as irrational. This reply assumes one view about voluntary acts: psychological determinism. On this view, our acts are always caused by our beliefs, desires, and other dispositions. Given our actual desires and dispositions, it is not causally possible that we act differently. It may be objected, if it is not causally possible that Kate act differently, she should not believe that, to act rationally, she ought to act differently. We only ought to do what we can do. A similar objection will arise later when I discuss what we ought morally to do. It will save words if Kate answers both objections. She can say, in the doctrine that ought implies can, the sense of can is compatible with psychological determinism. When my act is irrational or wrong, I ought to have acted in some other way. On the doctrine, I ought to have acted in this other way only if I could have done so. If I could not have acted in this other way, it cannot be claimed that this is what I ought to have done. The claim 1, that I could not have acted in this other way, is not the claim that 2, acting in this way would have been impossible given my actual desires and dispositions. The claim is rather 3, that acting in this way would have been impossible even if my desires and dispositions had been different. Acting in this way would have been impossible whatever my desires and dispositions might have been. If claim 1 was claim 2, determinists would have to conclude that it is not possible for anyone ever to act wrongly or irrationally. They can justifiably reject this conclusion. They can insist that claim 1 is claim 3. Kate could add, I am not claiming that free will is compatible with determinism. The sense of can required for free will may be different from the sense of can in the doctrine that ought implies can. These senses are held to be different by most of those determinists who believe that free will is not compatible with determinism. This is why, though these determinists do not believe that anyone deserves punishment, they continue to believe that it is possible to act irrationally or wrongly. Kate may be wrong to assume psychological determinism. I claimed earlier that our beliefs about rationality may affect our acts, because we may want to act rationally. It may be objected, this misdescribes how these beliefs affect our acts. We do not explain why someone has acted rationally by citing his desire to do so. When someone acts rationally, it may be trivially true that he wanted to do so, but he acted as he did because he had a belief, not a belief and a desire. He acted as he did simply because he believed that he had a reason to do so. And it is often causally possible for him to act rationally whatever his dispositions and desires are. Note that this objector cannot claim that it is always possible for someone to act rationally, whatever his desires and dispositions are. Even if he denies determinism, this objector cannot claim that there is no connection between our acts and our dispositions. This objector must also admit that our desires and dispositions may make it harder for us to do what we believe to be rational. Suppose that I am suffering from intense thirst, and am given a glass of iced water. And suppose I believe that I have a reason to drink this water slowly, since this would increase my enjoyment. I also have a reason not to spill this water. It is much easier to act upon this second reason than it is, given my intense thirst, to drink this water slowly. If the objector's claims are true, Kate's reply must be revised. She might say, "It would be worse for me if my strongest desire was to avoid doing what I believe to be irrational. It is better for me that my strongest desire is that my books be as good as possible. Since this is my strongest desire, I sometimes do what I believe to be irrational. I act in this way because my desire to make my books better is much stronger than my desire not to act irrationally. You claim that I could often avoid acting in this way. By an act of will, I could often avoid doing what I most want to do. If I could avoid acting in this way, I cannot claim that I am in no sense irrational. But given the strength of my desire to make my books better, it would be very hard for me to avoid acting in this way. And it would be irrational for me to change my desires so that it would be easier for me to avoid acting in this way. Given these facts, I am irrational only in a very weak sense." Kate might add, "It is not possible both that I have one of the best possible sets of motives in self-interested terms, and that I never do what I believe to be irrational. This is not possible in the relevant sense. It is not possible whatever my desires and dispositions are. If I was never self-denying, my ordinary acts would never be irrational. But I would have acted irrationally in causing myself to become, or allowing myself to remain, never self-denying. If instead I cause myself to have one of the best possible sets of motives, I shall sometimes do what I believe to be irrational. If I do not have the disposition of someone who is never self-denying, it is not possible that I always act like someone with this disposition. Since this is not possible, and it would be irrational for me to cause myself to be never self-denying, I cannot be criticized for sometimes doing what I believe to be irrational. It may now be said that, as described by Kate, S lacks one of the essential features of any theory. It may be objected, no theory can demand what is impossible. Since Kate cannot always avoid doing what S claims to be irrational, she cannot always do what S claims that she ought to do. We should therefore reject S. As before, ought implies can. Even if we deny determinism, this objection still applies. As I have claimed, we must admit that since Kate does not have the disposition of someone who is never self-denying, she cannot always act like such a person. Is it a good objection to S that Kate cannot always avoid doing what S claims to be irrational? Remember Schelling's answer to armed robbery. In this case, on any plausible theory about rationality, it would be irrational for me not to make myself very irrational. But if I do make myself very irrational, I cannot avoid acting irrationally. On both alternatives, at least one of my acts would be irrational. It is therefore true that in this case, I cannot avoid acting irrationally. Since there can be such cases, an acceptable theory can imply that we cannot avoid acting irrationally. it is no objection to S that it has this implication. We may believe that these claims do not fully answer this objection. A similar objection will be raised later against certain moral theories. To save words, I discuss these objections together in section 15. I shall now summarize my other conclusions. In the case of many, and perhaps most people, the self-interest theory is indirectly self-defeating. It is true of each of these people that it would be worse for him if he was never self-denying, disposed never to do what he believes will be worse for him. It would be better for him if he had some other sets of motives. I have claimed that such cases do not provide an objection to S. Since S does not tell these people to be never self-denying, and tells them, if they can, not to be, S is not failing in its own terms. Nor do these cases provide an independent objection to S. Though they do not refute S, for those who accept S, these cases are of great importance. In these cases, S must cover not just ordinary acts, but also the acts that bring about changes in our motives. According to S, it would be rational to cause ourselves to have, or to keep, one of the best possible sets of motives in self-interested terms. If we believe that we could act in either of these ways, it would be irrational not to do so. In the case of most people, any of the best possible sets would cause these people to do, sometimes in a quite voluntary way, what they know will be worse for them. If these people believe S, they will believe that these acts are irrational, but they need not believe themselves to be irrational. This is because, according to S, it would be irrational for them to change their motives so that they would cease to act irrationally in this way. They will in part regret the consequences of these irrational acts, but the irrationality of these acts they can regard with complacency. This is rational irrationality. It may be objected to these claims that they falsely assume psychological determinism. It may sometimes be possible for these people to do what they believe to be rational, whatever their desires and dispositions are. If this objection is correct, these claims need to be revised. When these people do what they believe to be irrational, they cannot claim that they are in no sense irrational, but they can claim that, given their actual motives, it would be very hard for them to avoid acting in this way. And it would be irrational for them, on their theory, to change their motives so that it would be easier to avoid acting in this way. They can therefore claim that they are irrational only in a very weak sense. Having explained once how these claims could be revised, I shall not mention this objection whenever, in what follows, it would be relevant. It would be easy to make the needed revisions to any similar claims.